Hey, it's Patrick from JMP Cycles, and this is our comparison of Indian's 2020 Challenger and Harley Davidson's 2020 Road Glide model. Now, a lot of hubbub about the Challenger model. Indian went right at Harley Davidson, offering their fixed fairing touring bike. So let's talk a little bit about some of the similarities or perceived similarities before we get into the details of breaking them down point by point. So basically, these are two American-made touring bikes, both V-twins, and both have fixed fairings. Both have kind of upgraded nav and communication systems in them. Both have ABS. But that's where things kind of start to drop off a little bit and the comparisons start to split apart. And one of those is the motor. The motor is a big talked about piece from the Challenger. And although, like I said, they're both V-twins, that's pretty much where the comparisons stop. Now, in the Harley, we have a motor we're very, very familiar with in the Milwaukee 8 platform, and I actually like quite a bit, especially when you start modifying it. The transmission and motor are just about unified on the Harley, but they're really not. They're divorced, you can split them apart. Where that's all unitized on the Challenger. And more so than that, it is a V-twin, but now we're dealing with a liquid-cooled overhead cam motor. The Harley is a 4-valve motor, but it's the typical cam down below, you got push rods coming up. This motor over here is much more up to date, and the output shows. On dynos around the country, we're seeing numbers we already know in stock form out of the Milwaukee 8. This is a 107, it's not a 114, of about 75 horsepower, 75, 77 horsepower out of a stock intake, stock pipes, stock Milwaukee 8 motor. Now, they have advertised with the Challenger here that it makes 122 horsepower and 128 foot-pounds of torque. I'm actually going to throw a link in the description to an article that explains the difference between crank and rear wheel horsepower. As far as rear wheel horsepower, what this is putting to the ground is more in the 105 horsepower range, which is a great number still. Just on numbers alone, the Challenger does outperform the Harley. Obviously, by quite a stretch, they have the horsepower number. But this motor is much better than just that final horsepower number. It's very, very linear. You can lug the motor and it takes right off. It doesn't get that lugged feeling. If you're running at too low a RPM, it still has plenty of power and it doesn't even feel like it's being lugged. Conversely, I found myself running at higher RPMs all the time with this motor just because it did not feel like it was being strained at higher RPMs. And let's define higher RPMs. That is a little bit of a bone to pick I have with the Challenger. It redlines right about 6 grand. It's very similar to the Harley, but I wish that was extended just a little bit. I don't think it needs it. I just personally wish that limiter was pushed a little farther forward on this bike. I was running it kind of upwards of 3,500 RPM a lot, partially because I kind of like running around that 3,000 number, but it didn't seem like it was there. I was always looking down and I was kind of surprised I was running the RPM I was running. I wish it would be able to stretch the legs a little bit more. Because the thing is so smooth, it does wrap up very, very fast. But the big takeaway for me out of the motor and the Challenger was its linear power all the way across the RPM range and its smoothness. It's a very, very smooth motor. So let's get just a little bit deeper into the setup of the engines. Like I said, liquid-cooled overhead cam motor versus air-cooled pushrod motor. But because of that design, they're kind of flipped on their head, where the Harley is a longer stroke, shorter bore. I believe a 3.9 to like a 4.25. Don't quote me on those numbers. The Challenger is actually the reverse of that. It's like a 4.25 bore and a shorter stroke, something in the 3.7 or 3.8 range, resulting in almost identical displacements. You got 108 cubic inches here, you have 107 cubic inches there. But because of their design, this one being an overbore with a shorter stroke, that one being a smaller bore with a longer stroke, power delivery is completely different. Where the Harley feels like it revs up and runs out right away, the Indian just keeps on pulls right off the bottom. And that claimed torque number at 128 foot-pounds out of the Indian is kind of disperses some notions that people think overbore motors don't make torque. This thing makes a ton of torque. But let's talk about how we're getting that to the ground in the drivetrains of these bikes. The lever pull on the Indian is much lighter than the Harley, but I think it has less feel. The Harley has a little more tension in the clutch. I think you get a little bit better feel, but at 11:1, which is the compression ratio of the Challenger, and at 10:1 on the Harley, I honestly feel more compression braking letting out the clutch on the Harley. Say you're at some high RPM, you drop to a lower gear, you kind of get that that compression braking feel a little more abruptly with the Harley's clutch setup versus the Challenger clutch setup. You can kind of drop those gears and let the clutch out and not feel the abruptness of it. As far as the transmissions, I was a little bit surprised by this. The Harley transmission feels a touch smoother than the Indian transmission. Indian transmission, when you first start to shift it and get used to it, it's a little more positive engagement. You really have to kind of give it a little bit more effort than the Harley, but once you get used to it, there's really no issue with either transmission. Both of them are pretty smooth shifting bikes. The clutches were kind of the difference in the power delivery. Once the clutch is out, both of them accelerate just fine. Obviously with the Challenger being the quicker of the two. Now, something else to talk about now that we used to not really have to talk about with American-made cruisers, and that is the electronics package on these bikes. Both of these bikes have traction control. Switching through that and getting that is actually pretty easy on this bike. It's a little bit different on the Harley. The button, there's a traction control button right on the left control, and that lights up. It doesn't light up on the big dash, it lights up down here on your speedometer. You see the rain mode, or you can see when you take traction control off. Whereas the Indian, you see it right on the screen. You can see your three modes. You have your rain mode, your standard mode, and your sport mode, and you have traction control, which is selectable on and off. Now, I can say this, while it probably is nice to have the rain mode, we rode in fairly slick conditions because we were riding at the snow had just melted. There's a lot of sand on the road. Even with that, I left the Indian in sport mode, and I left the Harley with traction control off because, quite honestly, they're both pretty abrupt. They're not as smooth as you would imagine, like on a sport bike or some of the standards out there with the hot rod electronics. They're pretty abrupt. If you get after it really hard, you do notice them pulling the power away from you. If you're in the rain, might not be a bad idea to switch to that. Otherwise, I just leave them traction control off and in sport mode. I don't really know if it's necessary to have those other modes on these bikes just currently because they're not as dialed in as I would like to see them. But with traction control off, both of them light the tire pretty easily. This Indian, the motor, like I said, is you probably take more advantage of the traction control leaving it on with this because it does spool up pretty quick with a lot of power to the ground. Okay, let's go on, start with chassis things. The chassis on this bike's pretty different, and suspension is also different. You have the 49 millimeter conventional fork setup on the Harley. You do have a certain amount of adjustability in the rear shock on this, and it's the old dual shock model, but now, of course, on the Harleys have the one big shock over here and the thinner shock on the left side, and you can adjust them a little bit, where the Indian gets a 43 millimeter inverted front end and a semi-adjustable Fox monoshock in it. And let me tell you, it is super stable in the corners. Man, we had some really fast entry speeds through some of our canyon roads out here with the Challenger. Some of them, my entry speeds were basically what I would do on my Dyna. The thing really gets over to the edge really quickly and then pull it back really quickly. These bikes both weigh within about 30 or 40 pounds of each other. The Road Glide weighing a little bit more. I didn't really notice the weight difference, but I did notice the chassis difference in how they perform going in and out of a corner. And really, if you start looking at the numbers, they're fairly similar in what they're giving for lean angles, right around 30, 31 degrees. Rake, I think the Harley's 26 and the Indian's 25 and change on the rake. Their wheelbases are pretty similar. The Indian's just a touch longer. But the setup of the bike, the Indian, requires a lot less effort to get it into the corner, get it back over if you're going into a set of switchbacks. The Indian, again, is the winner on the suspension front. I wish it was a little bit stiffer, and if you start giving me a wish list, obviously adding adjustable suspension to the front or a little bit stiffer setup, I would like that. But something I also want to address is tire choice by the Indian. The wheel size is almost identical again. The Harley's with the Dunlop, but Indian went with the Metzler Cruise Tech, which the Cruise Tech came out a little bit before this bike came out and was largely kind of heralded as a really good performing cruiser tire. And I tell you what, it lives up to the hype. And I honestly believe having those tires on this Indian helps the overall setup. It'd be interesting to ride the Harley with a set of Cruise Techs on it too to see how it did. But the Indian, again, the overarching thing I get here is smooth. The Indian chassis is smoother. Felt things getting less upset to the front of it than I did with the Harley. The Harley tends to be a little weirder feeling, not quite as settled in feeling as the Indian. The brakes, I kind of assumed the brakes would be better on the Indian. We're talking 320 millimeter floating rotors with real radial mount Brembos. The reason I say real is because Harley has There are 4 pistons up front that are not radial mount that are made by Brembo, but we're talking Brembo radial mount calipers on the front of this thing. It looks awesome and they perform really awesome as well. So in the front brake department, the Indian is again clear winner. The brakes on that, ton of feel. They get down right now. I mean, you can get on them. It takes very little input to get a result out of the front brakes on the Indian. Again, a win there. But why I specified front is because both these bikes have ABS. And I think the ABS on the Harley works better, specifically because of the rear brake setup. A couple of times coming in kind of hot to corners on the Indian, I went for my rear brake, and the ABS is almost like it's too sensitive. When I got on that brake pedal, it was engaging ABS quite a bit and basically left me with no rear brake feel. And again, this is in an extreme situation. In all of the other situations, around town, whatever normal riding, the rear brake is fine. In an aggressive riding situation, I would have liked to had more bite and more feel on the rear brake of the Indian. The Harley was a little bit better at that. Overall, still, Indian brakes were better, kind of specifically because of those big monster Brembos on the front, as opposed to the 4-piston 300mm setup on the Harley. Man, those Indian front brakes, they are monsters. And it's not just they're monsters, it's the lightness of input you have to make them do what you want is spectacular on the Indian, although I'd like to see a little bit better rear brake setup out of them. And both of them, the ABS stays on all the time. All right, so let's get into actually how the bike feels and some of the accessories. Let's talk seating. Now, I did like the Indian seat a little more than the Harley seat because it has kind of that step-up design. That being said, the aftermarket's where it's at. Judging the stock seats is kind of a pointless endeavor to me because whatever the aftermarket has is probably gonna be better, feel better, and look better. So the stock seating is probably a little bit better on this because of the step-up design, but I don't really care because if I own either one of these bikes, I'm gonna be changing it. Same thing with the bars. The bar position of the Challenger looks a little bit weird. It looks like it kind of comes way back to you, but for me, it was pretty comfortable where the Harley goes up just a little bit. So again, judging stock bars is not really what we do here. We are gonna do handlebar jobs to both of these bikes, and if I owned either one of them, I would swap it out to a set of bars I like. But what I will say is where the controls and gauges and kind of infotainment centers are, the Indian is closer, and I'm a little bit short-armed, so reaching that touchscreen was very, very easy. On the Harley, I actually have to kind of twist my shoulders and reach out there to get to that screen, where on the Indian, it's closer. The other thing is gauge placement. On the Harley, you have the gauges down here, traditionally where the Road Glide has them, under this touchscreen, and it didn't bother me a ton until I rode this bike, and the gauges are the opposite. The gauges are on top of this screen and essentially like right in your line of sight so you can see them really easy. They're also very well shaded from the sun, where these with that silver backing, if you have a lot of sun beating down on it, it actually make them a little bit difficult to see, especially with some of the icons you need to see in this Speedo. Like I said before, when you're switching through traction control, rain mode, things like that, the little icons that light up are down here on this, and that can be a little bit difficult where pretty much everything is ran through this big screen on the Indian. And I will say, intuitively, all the functionality of the nav and the stereo and all the hot rod stuff they have in the screens was a lot easier to do on the Indian. I've actually ridden a Harley, obviously quite a bit more. I've ridden a lot of Road Glides, and sometimes I still find myself searching for functionality here. There is a little bit, on the controls, and some of it you have to run through the touchscreen. You have that same option here to actually run things through the controls. I really love that left trigger button on the control housing over here. It lets you cycle through things. And there is a little bit more functionality and some more options in the Indian that you don't get in the Harley. Some of the ride tracking and the elevation and things like that is a little bit better on the Indian than it is on the Harley. That being said, both of them have pretty functional dash setups as far as like their infotainment style systems. The stereo, again, something that I think, as far as stock is concerned, it's almost a waste of time because I would upgrade both stereos in these bikes. The Harley only has 25 watts per channel, so basically 25 here, 25 there. The Indian's a 100 watt system, 50 watts either channel, and you can definitely tell a difference. This bike is louder. That being said, if there's aftermarket stuff available for this, I'd be adding it. But this stereo, stock form, is louder. GPS on them is very, very similar. Both systems work fine. Both of them have tire pressure monitors in them. Indian's a little more graphic, so it has like a little more kind of cartoonish to it, which I like. There's also the option to run night mode on the dash in the Indian. And here's something really interesting about the Indian when it comes to kind of the whole cockpit situation, is this windshield is adjustable electronically. The flip of your thumb, you can run it up or down. And I found myself doing that more than I thought I would, depending on where I was at, if I was on the highway, if I wasn't on the highway. There's a vent in there that, you know, kind of comes into play the higher you get up. The Harley has the vent up here, which you can open and close. They both have the Ram air vents, but you can open and close the Indian Ram air vent, where you can't do that with the Harley. Let's move on to the bags. This is where I think Harley is a clear winner. The bag setup on the Indian, I don't like the big locks on the top and the big handles on the top. It's a lot slicker setup on the Harley with the hidden kind of lever down on the side. Also, taking the bags on and off the Harley, much, much easier. One kind of cool point though with the Indian is that it has a remote. You can lock and unlock the bags just like you would the doors on your car. So that's kind of cool. Both of them have similar storage systems here in the like glove box area, I would say. The Indian's extremely similar to the Harley. Both of them, you can plug in a USB device. You can plug your phone in there or whatever. You can actually charge stuff up a little bit in there. The Indian lighting is a little bit better, I think. It's more visible on the back. You have LEDs on this bike where you have incandescents on this bike in the back. That being said, lighting's another thing, especially on the rear end of the bikes, that I would go to the aftermarket with to solve. The Indian up front though, again, this is gonna be a matter of personal taste. You got a lot going on here. The Harley's got some really nice LEDs, but the Indian has some as well, and the signals are integrated in here, which is really nice. With the Harley still uses these bad boys on the outside here, but again, lighting is something I go straight to aftermarket for. As a complete package, I really like Road Glides. I've spent a ton of time on these, ridden them across country multiple times, through twisties, about every kind of situation. Having said that, the Indian to me, in this particular form, is the clear winner. It's quite frankly probably the best stock bagger I've ridden, definitely the most fun. And I've ridden Gold Wings and BMWs and all kinds of hot rod stuff. The Indian to me just really, really performs well. In its current form, that's a tough hill for the Road Glide to climb. In this form, it's clear-cut winner. This bike is superior in my opinion. But where the differences are gonna come into play, aftermarket. Right now there's a ton of, there's a million things out for this Road Glide. There's gonna be stuff out for this Challenger. We're gonna make some modifications to it and make videos for you guys. But there's gonna be a larger aftermarket for quite some time, probably for the Road Glide. And then you get into engine modifications. You're probably not gonna see that much really for this bike, and honestly, it doesn't really need that much. But you're gonna have a lot more aftermarket options, is what I'm trying to say, for the Road Glide than you are for the Challenger, in the form of exhaust, and you're gonna have more handlebar options. You're probably gonna have maybe a few more mirror options. So if you're diehard Harley, you could build this bike into a performer. We have a video on how to put a cam in an M8. You put a cam in an M8, it's a 100 horse motor. So right there, you've gone, and now you're sitting in that same kind of air as the Challenger here. That means you're gonna have to spend, a couple grand to get this motor up to the output of this motor. And again, it's not gonna be apples to apples. The engine setups are different. Smaller bore, longer stroke, bigger bore, shorter stroke. So just because you get that horsepower number out of the Road Glide here, doesn't mean it's gonna perform exactly like this motor. This motor is really good in a lot of places, very, very smooth. For me, the Challenger is the overall winner. This is an awesome bike. I can't wait to ride more of. Can't wait to make some modifications to. But the Road Glide is still gonna be there. It still has that huge aftermarket presence. If you really like to build things, like get your hands in there and make a bike yours, this may be the bike for you. As always, have any questions or comments, feel free to drop us a comment. Go ride those motorcycles.